maybe that could impact you here in the United States. And of course, things local and national. We try to bring it down to bring it back to a local level, kind of not deal with just all, the international situations, but we do like to talk about different things and how they can impact us here in Stewart. Sometimes we think we're so far away from some of the things that are going on that we don't always pay a lot of attention to that. So that's what the purpose of this program is. It's about trying to identify or talk about some of the things that are going on in the world that may have an impact on you locally here. And then vice versa, we talk about some of the things that are happening locally that could eventually have an effect on what's going on around the world. So it's just a conversational program, free to call in. 220-9788, 220-WSTU is the number in the studio. If you've got a question or comment, or want us to expand on want me to expand on a topic. But the program is designed not to be extremely political, but it does tend to be a little political on the finance side, and not from the standpoint of necessarily, kind of a Republican Democrat, but philosophies and how they, how they may or may not work in certain situations based on the economics of the transaction. So that's kind of it. It sounds kind of boring, but we try to keep it kind of light, a little bit easy going, and trying to get people to understand, or trying to just talk about some of the issues, not even just to understand, but to kind of get them out there, to let people think about some of the things. It's a show where hopefully after you're done, you go, oh, I never thought about that. Let me think about that a minute. So anyway, that's kind of it. My name is Mark Brackbill. I'm a CPA, have spent 25 or 26 years in my own practice, dealing with all kinds of mostly small business clients, although I do have some larger clients. And earlier in my career, I did work with all of the big banks, a lot of the big banks in Chicago, and in the banking industry. And then I also spent about 13 years, 10 to 13 years in banking directly, having been a chief financial officer of a bank and chief operating officer of a bank, and had an opportunity to deal directly in the banking environment, which, as a kind of a segue, it's kind of interesting. As a CPA, I deal with a lot of issues, and I do a lot of business planning. Some CPAs, they do tax returns, and that's kind of what they do. I do tax returns, but I'm a big advocate of the fact that doing a tax return is ultimately just a cost to you. It doesn't do anything for you. You're paying me to do it right, and it helps if I do it right, but you kind of expect that. So it's just a cost. And by doing your tax return correctly, I'm not saving you any money. I'm just doing it correctly. I have clients that wished I would do it incorrectly so that they would save money, but I can't do that. Now, if you come to me early, before the end of the year, we can plan, and maybe and before you enter into certain things, we can plan, and then maybe we can get an outcome. And that's kind of what I, on the CPA side, I've been doing. But on the banking side, it's kind of interesting because you're right out there on the beginning and on the forefront of what's going on in the world, financially and economically, especially if you're in the financial area of a bank. I always enjoyed, I don't want to go back to it, but I always enjoyed being the chief financial officer, or the head financial person of a financial entity. That's kind of cool, because not only in the finance area, in the banking area, are you on the cutting edge of new things like hedging transactions and options transactions and futures transactions and all kinds of interesting things that have come about or taken place to make the economy work better, and give people more options. But at the same time, you're also in charge of the way that financial institution runs. So you've got to deal with all of those products that they've sold and what impact it has on you as a bank. So it's kind of it was an interesting and a learning process. I'm one of those people that over all my life, I never considered a job to be bad if you learn something from it. Sometimes what you learn from it isn't always great from the standpoint of it can be painful. It's not always a positive experience, but if you learn something from it, it helps. And for me, that experience has been one that has helped me quite a bit with my own clients now in the CPA area, and so it's been kind of interesting from that standpoint. So that's kind of the show as far as what we're looking to do. I want to pick up a little bit. We've been talking over the last few weeks about some of the things going on, and we've talked about competition and free markets and things. That's kind of the crux of any economic discussion that you're talking about. Is in at least in the United States, what is a free market, what is not a free market, and what's going on there are significant. And one of the things that, just a point of background that I'd clarify and make a point of, is that you'll hear all of these people, and they're Republicans and Democrats, but you'll hear Republicans a lot, what I call pro-business Republicans, that will say the government needs to be out of a business's business. They shouldn't be involved in that. We got to let the market decide. We heard that on insurance. We heard that on we've heard it in the banking area. We've heard it a lot of places, and that statement is not true as it relates to economics. So if you're talking about economically, you don't stay out of government does not stay out of every market. And I know there's people out there just cringing, these conservatives that are thinking that, it's blasphemy to say that, but it's not. If you have a market that is not a balanced market, it doesn't have equal strength on both sides of the equation. The definition of a free market is equal sellers and equal buyers. If you get a skew in that that you have a large amount of sellers and very few buyers, you're not going to get a fair price, because those buyers will be able to dictate, because there's way more people that need to sell than people that need to buy. So they will be able to control that market, especially if we're talking about very, very limited numbers, or if we're talking about, we're talking about entities that are very, very powerful. So right now, the only free markets are generally ones that are small business. Once you are successful and cease to be a small business, many, many, many times your market then needs to be regulated. And people say, well, why? You're regulated for your success. Yeah, actually, in many cases you would be, because what happens is that if you're very, very successful and you put your competitors out of business, you're now a monopoly. Well, monopolies, you can't have a fair price. So that would mean that you could charge whatever you wanted for your services. Presumably, there are a lot of people that now need them or want them, because that's how you got to be big and profitable. And so at that point, it's not, you're never going to get equilibrium price, a fair price, because you have too much strength on one side of the equation. And that is, that is the problem. So it's, and so then the government has to step in, especially if that product that you provide, or that service that you provide, is key to our defense, or to, to the market, that kind of thing. I mean, for example, let's say that and it has kind of come down to this way. We have, in effect, two cell service providers in the United States. And so if they, if they want to merge, for example, the government's got a say in that. That's not going to be a good thing. But even at two, that's not competition. So there's no fair price in the cellular market. Now, what's the alternative? You could let others in, but there aren't many out there. You'd have to go to overseas, maybe let some of these, maybe China's got their network. You want to let them in. Um, but do we want to do that in that kind of a market when much of our defense may be based on that? Much of our, the ability to keep out and to keep information private may be jeopardized. So you've got to look when we're talking about economics. You can't just blindly use we got free markets. This is laissez-faire. Stay out of it. That kind of thing. That's not the way it works. That's not the way that economically a free market. That's not what they mean when they say, we have a capitalistic system and a free market. We have a capitalistic system. We don't always have a free market. When we have a capitalistic system and we don't have a free market, that market has to be regulated if you want a fair price. That's just the way it works. That doesn't mean we've given up capitalism. That doesn't mean we've become communists. It just means that we have had to regulate a certain aspect of the market. Now that bothers people, and it should, because now the government is the big party. And you've got and if you don't take steps to prevent it, the government will always then regulate that market. So the idea is not to regulate the market forever. The idea is to step in and regulate the market until it gets diverse enough and large enough to regulate itself through free market principles. And that's what, for example, that's what that's what the government tried to do under the Affordable Care Act, under Obamacare. The concept there was that there is no free market in the insurance, in the health insurance area, which was actually true, and particularly in pockets of the country, but it was actually true. So the government says we need to regulate that so that we can get a fair price, right? So, so what they did is decided they were going to cap that price. Here's what you can charge. And they've been doing that for years in Medicare and Medicaid. Here's what you can charge. This is all we're going to pay. But in the long run, then, if the people that are in that market can't provide at that price, they get out. And that's what happened in the healthcare industry. One of the things, there was a lot of people that originally, when the Affordable Care Act came into play, said, well, how can this be a bad thing if you've got the major insurance companies that are participating? How could that be? Why wouldn't they be fighting it? Well, because they knew that it was going to consolidate the market. In other words, they knew that they would still be around because they were big enough to push back a little bit, but all of the small providers would go away. And if all of the small providers go away, now you don't have that competition. So all you're negotiating with is the federal government. And if you're one of only, say, 2 providers, you've got at least a little strength on your side, because you can say, hey, I can't make it work at that price. I'm out. You figure out who's going to do it. And that's kind of what happened. And so consolidated. What was also supposed to happen there, but didn't, is that everybody was going to be required to have health insurance. So the thought was that right now, the only people that at the time, before it was implemented, the thought was that really the only people that had health insurance were those people who were sick and they needed it because they knew they were going to use it, or people who it was provided for them through their employer. But many of them were older. They're especially plans that covered a lot of things. They were older employees. So at the time that the Affordable Care Act was looked to be implemented, they were implementing it. Their concept was, let's regulate it because it's not a free market, and then let's try to make it a free market by making everybody have to buy. So if we make everybody have to buy, and there's a lot of buyers, that will bring all of the healthy people into the into the into the insurance market, brings a bunch of healthy people. That's where the insurance companies make a lot of money, because they don't take much service and they still pay a decent fee. So the idea was, all right, now then there'll be some of these smaller players on the outskirts that will then say, hey, you know what? I'll do that. I can handle that because now I'm going to make money off of this thing. So I'm going to jump back in. And so what they had hoped at that point was that there would be a large number of buyers. The government would be able to regulate the price from the small sellers that were out there until other sellers came into the market and, tried to try to compete and force the price down a little bit. That was the concept. Unfortunately, it did not work that way, but the concept, that's why, President Obama said, if you like your doctor, you keep your doctor, because he realistically thought that what they were doing would result in the medical profession doing better, because they would have more business and would be able to, potentially make a profit. What he didn't really count on is the fact that the market was so small that the large insurance companies managed to cut everybody off, and the prices of insurance on their own didn't come down. Healthcare costs, didn't go down, and so therefore, price didn't go down. And no matter what you regulate, if I'm the government and I tell an insurance company you cannot charge more than X, and it's always all my cost is X plus 10, eventually it gets to the point pretty quickly that I can't survive anymore. So even though you're telling me you got to charge this, if the government regulates that price, controls that price below what somebody can make a profit at, and that's really where you need to be, because if you can't make an economic profit, which an economic profit is basically covering all of your expenses, including an appropriate, not an outrageous, but an appropriate return to your investors, stockholders, that if you can't do that, then you go out of business. From an accounting standpoint, we have a concept called break-even analysis. The break-even analysis is the point that you don't make any money and it doesn't cost you any money. That's the point where you are, and from that standpoint, if you're breaking even, you will stay in business. If you're making money, you will stay in business. But if you're losing money, you then have to look at, when do I shut down? Because you can't lose money forever. I mean, the market will shut you down because you don't have cash flow. You won't have money to survive. But realistically, when a business looks at, if their business is losing money, it looks at, when do I shut down? You shut down when you're not even covering your, what they call variable costs. In other words, if I'm a pharmacist, say Kim Jones, the prescription shop, if I'm a pharmacist and I'm selling a pill for $100, because I'm selling a pill for $100, and the insurance company is only going to pay me $80 for that pill, right? And I'm selling it for $100, and they're only going to pay me $80. Well, I'm losing money at that point. Now, I might still continue to do that because let's say that pill that I'm selling for $100 because at $100, that's going to cover part of my utilities and my my water and sewer and my overhead, my lease. It's going to cover all of those things. It's going to help cover some of my staff, my accounting people, and all of that. That's called overhead. It's, those are all indirect costs. So if the $80 the insurance company gives me, which is $20 less than I need to make, I'm going to lose money at that point. I still may do that if the cost of the actual pill to me, the medication itself, is less than $80, so that I'm making money on what's called your variable cost. Your variable cost is that direct expense. So, but I'm not going to do that forever, because if I don't provide not just some money to my overhead, if I don't ultimately cover my overhead in the long run, I'm going to be out of business, because I can't afford to pay my lease payment. I can't afford to pay my utilities and all of those kind of things. So in the short run, I may continue to do that for a period of time, because I'm providing something towards my electric and something towards my utilities and that kind of thing. And then I might hope that also that I've got something else that's generating income for me, is providing a big enough profit for me to cover not only the overhead associated with that service, but some of the overhead associated with these other services that I'm not getting paid on. But that's only in the short run. In the long run, all costs are variable costs. If I have a lease, it's over in 5 years. I'm done. I don't have to lease that space anymore. And so therefore that cost is now a variable cost. It doesn't exist anymore as a fixed cost. I don't have it no matter what. Whereas up to that point, every day that I walk in there, whether I sell one thing or zero pills or whatever, I still have to pay my rent. So when you're looking at economics, it's that big picture. It's that forward process. There are little blips in between. When you look at it, you say, well, why would people keep doing that? Well, they would keep doing it like in big pharma's standpoint, or in the healthcare industry, the insurance companies. The insurance companies kept doing it because they hoped that at some point that they were covering some of their overhead. They hoped that at some point there would be enough people coming in the system that that would be paying them, that they didn't have to have any costs associated with, healthy people, and that would give them the money that they needed. They hoped that the private insurance would, that they're, from a private insurance standpoint, they were hoping that, that maybe the cost would go down and they'd be able to provide it at less cost. When they saw that wasn't going to happen, they basically started bailing, and companies that were out there ceased to exist, that had been competitors, that were helping to provide a competitive market. For example, we don't hear much at all now about health savings accounts, although they're in the plan. But health savings accounts were really good programs for people to manage their health care. But when you're given the health care at less, at a price where you don't have to manage it anymore, you're not going to use the HSA accounts. And unfortunately, as the government regulated the standard insurance policies below what the HSAs could offer their services for, a lot of people weren't taking advantage of the HSAs. It became, and then some of those people that provided that benefit went out of business, didn't offer it anymore. So it's important to understand this concept of short-term, long-term, variable cost, fixed costs, because in Florida, this is a significant thing that impacts you, and it's going to continue to impact you. In the healthcare industry, let's face it, we have an older population, and and the government for that population does not pay you back. It does not, it does not pay you what you incurred. Years ago, Medicare and Medicaid was based on a cost formula. They would reimburse you your costs. You couldn't make a profit. Now, there's a there's something right away that tells you you got a problem, because from an economic standpoint, for you to continue to survive, one of your costs is a return to your investors. It's a profit. You have to produce a profit, or nobody will finance you, either finance you with capital or finance you with loans. But if you don't cover those costs, you'll be out of business. So you can see that in the short run, if I'm not going to provide a profit, if I'm a business, I might in the short run say, okay, I might be able to handle that. But in the long run, I can't. And frankly, if I'm a publicly traded company, that long run is about 2 or 3 years. Because if I'm not producing a return to my investors in some manner as a publicly traded company, whoever owns my stock is going to sell it and buy another company that's producing a profit, because investors don't invest in companies that don't produce a profit. The stock market, I think sometimes, now in particular, has absolutely no connection to reality. The multiples of earnings that some of these big companies are selling for are based on theories of success that just aren't going to happen, but we continue to throw money at it. And part of it is because, as I've said, many companies, if you're large enough to be traded on the New York Stock Exchange, if you're that big at that point, especially if you're part of the S&P, you're part of the S&P 500, you probably don't have much competition, not at your size. I mean, if there are 500 companies, there are not 400 of them that are insurance companies. So it's not like all these big companies have competition. If there's 500 companies, 4 of them are insurance companies or insurance related companies, maybe even healthcare companies. You're talking less than 10. And the rest of them are all small companies around the United States that really can't compete, or niche products that are only in a particular market, like the HSAs. So when you think about it, our system, our free enterprise system, when everybody says, look at the stock market, look at how good it's doing, has nothing to do in general with free enterprise, because the companies that we're looking at are generally not they're monopolies, oligopolies, or very large companies that don't have appropriate competition to produce a fair price in their market. That's why they're on the exchange, because frankly, they can produce a larger profit. I have companies that do the same thing as companies that are on the stock exchange. Those companies, my companies, don't produce anywhere near those kind of profits that they can afford to pay out the dividends that those companies pay out, that they can afford to pay the benefits that those companies can pay out. They can't do that. Why? Not because they're inefficient. They're very efficient. Actually, they're extremely efficient because of their competition. They have to, but they don't have access. They don't have access to the markets that these big companies do. So let's say, for example, I'm a large aircraft manufacturer, and I've got a new product coming online. Maybe I want to have a new product come online. I want to get it pumped out quickly. I think it's going to let me take over a market and force out any competition that I might have. So now I don't have the internal capital at this point to do that. So, but I'm big enough. I go out onto the corporate debt market. I issue my own bonds, and I sell my own bonds cheaper than I can get money from the bank. And those bonds might be 10 years. They might be 20 years. So now I just funded my operation at maybe 2% interest rate for 10 years or 15 years or whatever with a corporate bond. My little company here in Stuart produces a better product and a better service, but they cannot borrow money and access the market for those kind of prices. So they end up, they can't compete with that. So that competitor comes into the market at a price less than I can come in to that market, because they've been able to obtain access to other benefits that I, as a small business, can't. And that's why right away I'm at a disadvantage. So right away, those big companies that are publicly traded, just by the definition of publicly traded, they have access to markets that the small business doesn't have. It may be able to get a good rate. It may be a big company for a local bank. So it may be able to get a good rate. But here's the problem now. Let's take that. That's a good segue, talking about banking. Are there any local banks anymore? No. What's happened in the banking industry? In the banking industry, we regulated it, which we needed to do, right? We needed to regulate the banking industry because it is a monopoly. It's not a legitimate, but it's an oligopoly, at least. There's a handful of large banks that control everything. We saw that through the COVID and the EIDLs, or the PPP loans, and all of that kind of stuff. We saw that the large banks dominated it. Who did those large banks take care of? Large customers. They had to compete with the publicly traded companies that had avenues for financing other than banks. So if they wanted to loan money to them, they had to do it at terms that were different than what they were loaning to the local business. But let me ask you this. Why does the bank even have to lend money locally? Well, they don't. And that's what the regulators missed when they implemented Dodd-Frank. And so was the fact that they implemented Dodd-Frank, is that wrong? They shouldn't have regulated the banking industry? Absolutely, that was not wrong. That was right. They had to regulate that industry. I mean, in the mortgage area, the home mortgage area, which dominates our economy. It determines building, construction, trades, income, furnishings. It dominates if we don't build houses and sell real estate, our economy suffers, right? So if on the other hand, and particularly in Florida, but that's true around the United States, we have an economy that has been subsidized towards housing. You get a tax break if you have debt to buy housing. So everything is all about housing and acquiring housing. And who's providing loans in that area? Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. What was Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac? They were quasi-governmental agencies. Okay, there was FHA too, which is VA, which is a direct government agency. So we had three people providing housing mortgages. And all three of those were actually subsidized by the U.S. government. So there was no competition there. So how can you look at that market and not realize it has to be regulated? It has to be regulated. Because otherwise those guys are going to get together and they're either going to merge or they're going to determine what the price is, and that's the price you're going to pay. Frankly, it is. When you look at it, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac tell everybody what they're going to buy loans at, what the price is in the current market. They set the interest rate. So when we've talked about the Federal Reserve and not having impact on long-term rates, they have none. But Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and FHA and VA have a significant amount of impact on long-term rates. And because they are in a different regulatory standpoint and they are treated differently, there's much more potential for interest rates to go up there, even though technically the government has some control over Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac because of its guarantee. But at the same time, they're probably not going to implement that to force rates down, because that will force people out of business. So we have this, it had to be regulated. Now, as I said before, you can regulate towards permanent regulation, or you can regulate towards trying to get the market back to a free market. You can try to skew the market in your regulation so that you give advantage to the person that's trying to get started, maybe the business that's not that big and can't have access to funding, or that potentially is going to be a competitor. So you can kind of try to do that. Now, that's that regulator's personal opinion. Really, I mean, it's the government's personal opinion. I don't like that very long. I mean, I don't like it at all. Frankly, it's a problem when a company becomes too large, or an industry becomes too small, too narrow. That's a problem. So, I don't like that. I mean, I'm just like the rest of the people. I want a free market, but I have to be wise enough to look at it and say that in the short run, that's not a free market. Can I get it to a free market? If I can, then I want to. If I can't, then it's going to be government controlled. Now, that's not a good thing based on the capitalistic system. In the long run, if we have more businesses controlled by government than we have businesses controlled by the market, we don't have capitalism. We have socialism, or we have communism. So that's, and that's actually how communism occurs. If you look at how communism gets implemented, somebody doesn't stand up one day and say, we're going to be communists today. Everybody needs to vote for communism. That didn't happen in Cuba. That didn't happen in Russia. That just didn't happen. Didn't happen in China. That's not what happened. Everybody just didn't stand up and say, we want communism. What happens generally is the people stand up and say, we're not happy with what's going on, and we need help. And here's our predator, not competitor, but predator. Here's the predator, and you got to have the predator to create the conflict that moves a government from one form of government, capitalism, let's say, democracy, to another form of government, communism, and a completely regulated central economy. People don't wake up in the morning and say, today I've decided we're all going to be the collective, and we're all going to make decisions collectively, and we're going to have communism, and nobody's going to own their own business because we're going to all own the businesses. That's not what happens. What happens is something occurs, a war, the predator is another country, or there has you have a pandemic, or you have some sort of conflict. The economy collapses for whatever reason, and you have some kind of conflict that people voluntarily turn to their government and say, we need you to solve our problem. And so what happens is there becomes a justification for not solving the problem towards the kind of government you've got, and the idea of trying to solve the problem towards the government that some people want. And that's not voluntarily done. It just sneaks up on you, and the next thing you know, you're there. Did Castro decide to be a communist? And then no, that's not what happened. When Castro came to power after the revolution, did he intend to be communist? No. He actually went out and tried to find places that he could, he probably would have just been a fascist. But his problem was that his economy couldn't run. After the war was over, after the revolution was over, people needed income, jobs, food, clothing, housing. They needed all those things. And the economy couldn't produce it. It wasn't capable of producing it. The producers of the economy, the backbone of the Cuban economy, had left the country, and they took their intellectual capital with them. That's a nice way to say that all the smart people got out early and left. And that's exactly what happened. And they went other places, and they took other stuff with them. Bacardi rum didn't get started is not a Cuban rum, from the standpoint that's not where it comes from now, but it is a Cuban rum. Why? Because the people that were producing it in Cuba left and took all of the stuff with them. So what happened is and a large portion of that economy was being driven by U.S. based companies, casinos, AT&T, all of these big companies, these international companies were driving the economy in Cuba when Batista was in power. Now, there was the predator. Batista and some of his friends became greedy. And they didn't have a free market system at that point. They had little buddies that got all of the goodies. And then some of that money got kicked back. So what happened was this predator that had been for years feeding on the Cuban economy, favoring some groups versus others, and in general, not favoring the working population. They were extracting more and more money, and that was not going to wages. And it created a desire by a large block of people to have something different. They didn't stand up all one day. All the workers didn't get together and say, we're going to be communist. They did get together and say, we need more power. We need more control. We should be paid more. So it was a workers' revolt, but it was not a communist revolt. It was not a People's Party revolt. It was a workers' revolt. And then once they got control, they had to say, wait a minute, what are we going to do? Who's going to pay us? Well, you know what? Nobody, because all of those companies that were in the country that were actually the problem, but they're now all gone. So it wasn't good when they were unregulated, but it certainly wasn't good when they were gone. So then Castro is in a situation he has to determine, he has to provide. How does he provide? Well, none of the other countries, the U.S. wasn't going to, we were trying to get him out of power. So he wasn't going to some of the other European countries. They didn't want anything to do with him because they were afraid of the same revolution. They were afraid that they would support the same kind of problem within their economy that he had created within his. So where did they go? The only place that would have them was Russia, really. And Russia wasn't going to have them if they weren't communists. So basically they had to support the communist regime and the communist philosophy, because their major source of everything, including defense and protection, was from a communist country. Communist country isn't out there going to be subsidizing a democracy. That's just not doing that. And Cuba had a problem. They knew the U.S. wanted them out, and unless they could get some sort of protection, like big missiles, nuclear warheads parked on an island pointed at the United States, they knew that they had problems. So that's how things change. And it's the economics that cause the change. It is not necessarily it's funny. People think it's the politics that cause the change. It's the economics that cause the change. And how the market goes determines where you end up. So, for example, if in the case of Cuba, the problem was there were very large, powerful companies with very little competition that were also had the backing and the support and sometimes the investment of their government, right? So instead of the government regulating that market, which it should have done. So Cuba was designed to be a capitalistic system. It was designed to be a free market. It had, over the years, become not one because of greed, corruption, and economic strength and power of a few versus the many. The first people that suffer in general in those kind of situations, now pay attention to this because this is kind of interesting. The first people to suffer in those transitional relationships, those transitional situations, are the workers, are people who have jobs. They are the workers who suffer because they're the ones, when you look at economics, and this is basic economics, a company, an economy, it generates costs, and those costs have to be fulfilled. You can't not fulfill them. So what happens when one of your costs, so the costs are labor, technology and equipment, a return on to your investors, taxes, those are all costs. If I artificially raise taxes so that government takes a bigger cost, I have to reduce something else, and I can't reduce return to the investors because my company goes away. All right. So some of my costs are fixed at a certain point in time. Over the long haul, they may not be. Over the long haul, I may be able to reduce my return to my investors because maybe the market isn't producing that kind of return. If I'm in a market where interest rates are 18%, I got to produce, an 18% return to cover that at least. But if I'm in a market where interest rates are 2%, then I only have to cover a 2% reserve. So I might be, if I'm in at a 3% return to my investors, maybe I was able to produce a little bit more than I should. Now I'm down to 2, right? So that you could potentially squeeze that out, but not much, because the fact of the matter is that particular price, the price for capital, is fixed. It's always going to be the best that you can get because it's all you can get. So, so you can't shop that around generally. So that ends up being fixed. Technology is adjustable. So I can increase that if I reduce my technology costs, though, I reduce potentially my ability to generate enough products. So I reduce my overall income, which then I have to reduce some other cost. If you follow me in this whole process, the one cost that tends to bear the brunt of it is wages. And that's why wages drive these changes in the market. What's happening right now? Right now in our economy, what's going on with some of the stuff politically and economically, it is pushing back all of these costs of the pandemic and everything else onto the labor. And they are revolting. They are complaining, and they will complain more. So anyway, we'll talk more about that next week, but I want you to think about that things. Think about the fact that that's how you end up with a communist. People don't wake up one day and say they want to be communist. It's the economics that forces the end result. Anyway, thanks for joining us here on Treasure Coast Solutions every Wednesday, 9 to 10 o'clock, right here on WSU Digital 1450, Martin County's Heritage Station.